And I'm going to turn it over to Enrique Diaz, who's going to give us an update on the ongoing work for the Mirador, the latest Mirador release. Following his presentation, we will have a Q&A. If you have questions and you want to post them in the meeting chat, that's fine. I will do my best to try to keep track of those and make sure that they get answered either during the presentation or during the Q&A period. And with that, I'll turn it over to Enrique.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And thank you, Martin, of the IIIF Consortium, for the opportunity to share with everyone here today. Just a brief update on the activity taking place in the Mirador community. My name is Enrique Diaz. I'm the manager for architecture and engineering in library technology services at Harvard, in service of the Discovery portfolio of products. I'm speaking with all of you today on behalf of a group of very talented and generous individuals spanning the globe, all working together to contribute to this open source effort, enabling the exploration of IIIF content in vital and meaningful ways. I'm going to provide a brief background on the software, a walkthrough of recent development history, and a kind of a snapshot on where work is currently focused. Along the way, I hope to provide the through line of the impact that academic and cultural heritage communities have, both in terms of challenges and opportunities to the work of supporting free and open software. So I suspect many of you know plenty well about Mirador, but nonetheless, I think it's important to set the level. So Mirador is configurable and extensible and easy to integrate IIIF image viewer, enabling image annotation and comparison of images. In addition to that, it supports transcription, unification of image exploration and observation, computational imaging. It can be a tool that's embedded in other sites and contexts. It can be used as a standalone viewer. It can be used as a customizable tool for research needs. And it can also be just a desktop application for viewing local files. Its applicability falls in, I think, a lot of the areas that I think are represented here by the attendees today in terms of being a tool in support of teaching, in support of research, and also especially in service of cultural heritage missions, useful in terms of exhibitions of materials, especially rare and valuable and salient academic ones. So very quick history. Back in 2018, a version of Mirador, version 3, was released. It was a major update to the version that preceded it. It was rewritten from the ground up in using a framework called React. It's a JavaScript-based software, or JavaScript-based framework. And the idea is that it responded to what was very clear at the time, the need for the viewer to be not just a solid and stable viewer, but also a flexible one, something that could be updated and extended to support the needs that are identified at very local levels in each of our circumstances, each of our situations. It supports the broad array of IIIF APIs, and I listed them here, but very briefly: image and presentation APIs, authentication, search of transcribed text, audio and video support through the presentation API, IIIF collection viewing, navigation. So that was released, and it got real quiet. Key contributors in the development of the Mirador 3 continued on their journeys in other communities, and they left some substantial shoes to fill. The attention that Mirador received just diminished, and for a number of years, there were very few updates to the core code. Honestly, it's a testament to the engineering of those contributors to Mirador 3 that the community could keep moving forward nonetheless, either through adoption or extension through plugin work for literally years. However, the times might catch up to us, and stricter standards for software stability and security steadily raise the needle around Mirador's incompatibility. I think as each of our missions continue to develop and the expectations continue to get more sophisticated, the gap between what Mirador could provide and what the community was expecting it could do was widening steadily. So how to pick up where others left off? The first step, and really the only one that could be made, was to examine the state of the supporting packages used to run Mirador. We needed to find the deltas, where the current state is and where things are in the code for Mirador, and to just chart a roadmap to get Mirador up to contemporary usability. So this is a journey to a refresh, as I like to frame it. It started with getting that React code that it was originally written in for version 3 up to not the most current version, but rather a stepping stone middle version, version 17. The reason for this was because there were other dependencies around how Mirador does what it does that needed to be at this level for updates to apply there. So once developers and contributors were able to get things to a good state, well tested and run in version 17 of React, it paved the way to be able to update other aspects of Mirador. In particular, Material UI is the front-end componentry that's used for the interface that you see when you're interacting with Mirador. Very, very at a very practical level, the icons that are representing all the interactions there, the layout, the support for right to left languages, etc. A lot of that is driven by this sort of front end presentation layer that is known as Material UI. This needed to be updated to a new version as well, in this case, version 5. And that was a substantial thing. For anyone in the room who develops code, imagine, very fundamental ways of identifying code literally just change their names. And now you had to sort of track down and trace back where all those names occurred, make sure that you made those appropriate updates, and make sure you didn't break anything along the way, that you didn't miss something. The other thing that needed to change was the move of the styling engine that sort of runs how everything is presented in Mirador, the JavaScript engine behind the style. It moved from JSS to Emotion, which is the version that Material UI version 5 was supporting. There were a couple of ways to go on this, and the community sort of deliberated on that to figure out what would be a more sustainable approach moving forward. And as we were making these decisions and sort of weighing the elements, we were trying to find ways to solicit input from the community. The idea behind making these decisions is that we're doing this as a group, and one can never really be sure if we're representing all the interests and all the angles. We have very talented people, but we don't know what we don't know. And so there was a lot of work to draw input from the community to be able to inform the decisions that we were making. So along the way, we were able to do that. We were able to sort of clear the path to the next step, which was to get it to React 18. So all of these things were just sort of in service to the ultimate goal, which is the most current supported version that is available. Well, it was available at the time for Mirador already. Updates to React are happening, and that's a story for another time. But the idea is that we are finally in a place that allows for contemporary activity to proceed at the very least. People who were working with Mirador to develop their own environments for their needs, for their institutions or programs, were able to do that without a whole lot of backwards compatibility or pulling out wires that they needed to do exclusively for their implementations. And at this point, I want to thank some of the key contributors here on this effort. This was about a year's worth of work. And even though this is sort of representing contributors at the institutional level, I nonetheless want to tip my hat to Leipzig University, Stanford, and the developers here at Harvard who worked on this over that year, both in terms of like writing the code, vetting the code, soliciting input on the code, and merging all of that into what is available now. And so now what we have is an alpha, what we call a release candidate of Mirador 4.0. It's very much one-for-one feature parity with the version of Mirador that was available before this, version 3.3.0. It now just has support for React and for Material UI 5, and that clears the path for contemporary plugin design. So in some cases, people were working on annotations. To just put it in a practical example, building something new requires invoking the calls to dependencies that are themselves contemporary. And there was fundamentally a mismatch between the version that was in core Mirador and what they needed to build on. And so now we've sort of cleared that conflict so that people can move forward in that respect. We released this in the sort of pre-release context because it's incredibly important that we kick the tires on this thing, that people are able to evaluate it and apply it in their circumstances, in their contexts, to confirm that things are indeed working as anticipated, or if not, what we need to address to make sure that it does. And I just provided the URL there to the releases page where you can find that right now. And so we're able to do that. I want to say it was around February or March of this year, where the release, the 4.0 release was available. And then we did a couple of subsequent releases based on some input that had already come through. So it's an alpha 2 right now. And then I got real quiet again, but this time not for long. So the experience of getting Mirador's dependencies updated imparted a number of lessons to the community of contributors, and the opportunities to apply what had been learned came immediately into play to determine what needed to happen next. So some of the next steps that have already started to happen, we will start with what we are doing with plugins. So one of the reasons that we are getting this out there for people to invest time in testing and commenting on is that we need to get this to a full release. And in some cases, very rightly and understandably, Mirador is more than just the core Mirador. It's an association of other activities such as annotations and being able to work with the images that are being explored in real time. It's those extensions that add so much value to the scholarly and academic experience of using Mirador in the first place. And so we realized that if we wanted to create incentives for people to evaluate Mirador 4.0, we needed to also spend a little time on the plugins, but there are dozens of those. And so how do we know which ones are the most used, most commonly included in people's implementations? And so the community organized a survey that you may have seen through the Google Group News facility, where we were simply soliciting from what we knew of the array of plugins available out there, which ones were the ones that mattered most to individuals. Along the way, we also sort of used the opportunity to kind of see if people were interested in helping in general with Mirador development. So there were a couple of questions we added in there, but the outcome revealed that there were these 4 in particular that that kind of like rose above the rest. So Mirador image tools, the ability to work with images in real time, the ability to download images from the viewer, to be able to create and share and work with annotations, and to provide text overlay for transcriptions and further exploration beyond the image. Work is now happening along various fronts to update these if they're not already updated. And so now we're just sort of like tying all these pieces together and being able to present the opportunity, the solicitation to evaluate Mirador in maybe a more resonant and meaningful way for people in the community. And now if we can get these plugins updated, then also now it might be a little more engaging for them. The other thing that had been happening is a lot of attention and focus on the user experience and accessibility. A lot of times these things are often intertwined, but the idea is that in the years that had elapsed between version 3.3 and where we are now with 4.0, the release candidate of 4.0, standards and understanding and application and frankly legal requirements had us putting a finer point on what Mirador is capable of doing and what it couldn't do as well as it should. And so just as those dependencies that I described earlier, we're sort of creating that gap in sort of its compatibility and applicability in the intended contexts. So too was the expectations around how a user interacts with it, and if they were using assistive devices to be able to explore these images, what could be done to make that a better experience. And so folks in the community had got together to sort of review what is in the issues backlog of the project repository in GitHub, to see what was already there, add what they have found along the way, and sort of coordinate a refinement of that backlog. And there's also work moving forward around IIIF community needs, which I'll speak on in a moment. Then there's also along the way what we need to do around enhancing inclusivity. So part of the challenge along the way was that you needed to know all about Mirador for you to jump in and be of assistance in taking it further. And that's a pretty high bar, especially when you have that kind of gap of time, because now you'll have potential contributors who know the current way to do things. And we're finding antiquated code, so to say, 2 or 3 years, that's antiquated in this context. So the idea is that we need to make the on-ramp a little more welcoming for contributors in whichever way they are interested in coming into the project. So one of the things that we did early on in some of this work was we included a code of conduct that made it very clear, what the expectations are, where we're drawing the lines of responsibility, et cetera, around how development happens in Mirador. And that starts to kind of create like, it makes the implicit explicit. It allows for people to understand where their value is most appreciated and where all of this kind of like comes into play. The other thing that we're working on is updating the file around information around how contributors can go in. So the contributing.md is a common markdown file that's included in projects that is that just sort of lists the ways that people can help. Now, already, in just talking about this, unless you already knew about GitHub, about project repositories, about basic code management, some of this is already foreign territory. So if you can imagine a digital scholar kind of coming into this picture, trying to figure out, it's like, I like this, I get this, I think I get this, I want to help. How do I help? They need to know about GitHub, they need to know about pull requests, they need to know about making commits. There's a lot there. And so if we're lucky, they've already crossed those bridges, but we don't want to assume that they've done that. So one of the things that we want to focus on is spelling out a lot of that stuff and making it, either pointing them in the right directions, or maybe spelling it out how it could be of most use in the context of what's needed for Mirador specifically. And that involves another activity, which is reviewing documentation. So we've got a few layers, sort of forensically speaking, of different versions of Mirador's documentation that sort of all sit intermingled. And that adds to the complexity of the challenge of just trying to figure out how you can work with it. So the opportunity to move into a new version with all the dependencies updated is also like a ground floor opportunity to just do a fresh start with reviewing documentation, reviewing guides, understanding what sort of resources would be particularly useful for anyone who's getting started or has been helping and would help even more if they knew a little bit more about the processes. So so that's also underway. And also more recently, in a more heady way, frankly, is how the build process for Mirador can be improved. There are a few steps here that really require like someone with engineering experience to be able to confidently build this. Unless a scholar had the experience of seeing this firsthand or being taught in a course or a workshop what it takes to stand this up locally and maybe deploy it to a server environment, there's a lot there that people have to do manually to get this up and running. So some of that can't be helped, but some parts can. And maybe something is there in terms of how this has been designed, sort of taking stock from the decisions made 3 or 4 years ago or even longer, actually. Yeah, my math gets a little fuzzy around the pandemic span, but the idea of being able to re-examine if there's anything that could be done better or in a more contemporary and relatable way to today's audiences of technologists and engineers and developers and enthusiasts. So all of that, I think, is where we're trying to sort of focus our attention, because that will yield the engagement we feel and the community building that we've long hoped to see with respect to Mirador, but really just open source software in general. And to that end, for a lot of this work, I want to, again, give a lot of credit to, at an institutional level, folks from the Canadian Knowledge Research Center, the University of Rennes, Stanford, NYU, Leipzig, and Harvard for their efforts across all of these activities. And there are also a handful of contributors that aren't necessarily represented by institutions. The fact that you're seeing a more like a broader set of logos here than you did earlier in what I was presenting speaks to the way that that this is all resonating, that it's attracting people and supporting people who are interested in contributing to the effort. So going back to the IIIF community needs, this is something you may have seen in recent messaging, and I wanted to boost the signal around this because this benefits Mirador, but it also boosts or is of interest to the broader community. Folks have been self-organizing to develop a set of activities around identifying what support the community needs for creating user-friendly and accessible IIIF-powered experiences. By developing personas, for example, in this activity, we're able to articulate and represent what challenges users face, both shared and unique circumstances, elevating relevancy and framing the task of solving those challenges in frankly relatable terms. So I encourage folks to follow this bit.ly link that will take you to the Google Doc that's in that screenshot there, and have a look and see where you can contribute. And then, as always, I'm always very eager to encourage people to join us in the conversations that we have. So that happens on IIIF Slack. If you're not on there, you can follow that bit.ly link, the bit.ly/IIIF-Slack, to be able to sign up for a request to join the Slack instance, the Slack team. And then there you'll find a Mirador channel, a Mirador dev channel, along with a bunch of other related channels, affinity-wise or product-wise. There's also links to other ways that you can get connected through the projectmirador.org website. There's a participate section there where you'll find links to the Google group that I've been referring to, and also the entry point into all the GitHub code repositories that are in the Mirador organization in GitHub. And last but not least, we have a semi-weekly set of community calls. They happen every Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, and 4 p.m. When is that? That's GST. I forgot what the G stands for, but this is roughly Central Europe. So Germany, I'm mainly thinking of at this point, but the idea is, yeah, we have an hour devoted to being able to engage with folks. It's a very free form agenda setting and conversation flowing hour that sort of informs where we go from here, and we just check in on the various threads of activity that are happening. As it happens, the next call is tomorrow. So I warmly welcome everyone who's here to join us and contribute to the conversation. And so with that, I will give you my thanks once again for your time. I really appreciated this opportunity. I'll, of course, take any questions that you have. But yeah, in the meantime, thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Enrique. We have a pretty big group, so I would anticipate that we will probably have a bunch of questions. As far as asking those questions, doesn't matter to me how you do it. If you would like to unmute yourself or raise your hand, if you would rather not speak, that's fine. You can put your question in the meeting chat and I will read it aloud for you. So I will give. No one yet? Okay. Well, I actually have a question, and this might be a question.
Oh, wait,
Oh, sorry.
Robert
Did
raised his hand
Robert?
there.
You get it. Go in.
Just start out with a technical question. In the old Mirador 3 days, one of the issues was when you also wanted to use one of the plugins. I mean, particularly thinking of the annotations plugin. Then you could not just do in your web page include Mirador and then include plugin, but you had to rebuild the plugin for JavaScript reasons.
Exactly,
That I
yeah.
never got into. Has that been improved, or is that still an issue?
Yes, no, actually, I think you hit the nail on the head because that was very much one of the calls to action a couple of years ago, realizing that just at the starting gate, someone interested in standing up a new instance of Mirador needed to do all this extra work to sort of like retrofit the packager or update the dependencies locally to get this all to work together. The whole goal of getting this up to a more recent version of React is cleared one of those blockers there. And I'll add to that, one of the challenges, it sort of created, not only was there that problem, there was also the emergent problem from that phenomenon where people just started to create kind of bespoke implementations that were veering further and further away from core. And they needed to. They had agendas, they had imperatives to be able to move forward however they needed to. And sometimes it was that they would go on their own. And so they start to kind of cultivate a very specific way of implementing Mirador that then becomes harder to like kind of walk back and figure out, oh, now there's an update. How do I incorporate this update that now has been refreshed in all these ways? So all of that sort of worked its way into understanding the urgency around like what we needed to do to just get it up to date and to remove that immediate obstacle for anyone just getting started. So yeah, I'm happy to say that's mostly resolved. So I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat, but Caitlin, you said you had one?
I'm going to take us down a tricky path. So let's get to everyone's
Oh.
questions.
Absolutely. Okay.
In there. Okay. So Kumar, I'll read it out just for people who aren't reading along and for people who want to watch the recording. We are planning to create a platform which will have manuscripts as images, along with audio and annotations on the viewer with a customized look. Do you think these are all possible with version 4?
Yes. And actually, I'd say that they were possible with version 3.3. Just, like in terms of like the idea of what the viewer could support and how it could be extended, the presentation API support that was built in starting with version 3 allows for the things that you're describing there. It was that you would just run into these sort of technical hurdles right from the start, as I was just sharing with Robert. So yeah. The idea is that 4.0 would continue to provide that kind of support. And I think the closer you adhere to what the specifications ask in terms of what IIIF has generated, the better off you are in terms of the tooling. Because what that affords you, Mirador is but one way that you can engage with users. Anything that adheres to IIIF specifications is going to be equally viable in their own ways. So if not Mirador, I think, yeah, you're already thinking in the right frame.
Okay, and then as a follow-up to that, is it advisable to use version 4 in the alpha release phase, or should we stick to the older version for the time being?
I think, yeah, this is a little tricky. Different institutions and shops have their own policies around this. I don't know if it's particularly encouraged to be introducing alpha level software in production, I would say locally, as you're developing your solutions internally and running things in a dev environment, for example, absolutely, 100%, because that's the way that this is going. And it'll already start to answer questions for you in terms of whether this is really going to meet your needs or what more it might take. You know, a lot of the implementation reveals other challenges. And from experience, things that are unique to your institution's upstream in terms of the data or the infrastructure that sort of spell out what needs to happen next. So I'd say I'd also encourage that you participate in the testing so that we can get it to a full-blown 4.0 so that we can just remove any of the hemming and hawing here. So yeah, I'd say move it forward in dev. Maybe not so much, in a live environment, but ideally maybe the timing lines up for you.
Okay, another question. As the 3D community is working hard to release the 3D specification, is it in your plans to potentially support 3D in the future?
Absolutely. Yeah. And right now, I think it's available by way of a plugin. It's not one of the ones that got a lot of votes. So it's going to need a little attention. Hopefully it won't be much. That's one of the things that we found with some of these plugins is it was a pretty light lift to make the updates that were needed because it just adds on top of the functionality that Mirador provides. It just sort of adds an additional veneer of functionality. And that is a lot of the extensibility that was just sort of built in philosophically and technologically into version 3 moving forward. So yes, there is support for 3D viewing. Right now it's in the plugin way, and I think it would probably stay in the plugin way. The whole idea is that you've got a core viewing experience, and then you add to it what is relevant for your needs versus building a tool that can do it all. A lot of that is probably not going to be relevant to your needs, and you'll find yourself having to customize it anyways. So, so I'd say look to the 3D or the plugin options that are available either right now or where maybe in the community, especially as far as people who are working on the spec are thinking or looking at. They'll often already have something in mind as they're sort of building this to validate what they're building in terms of the specifications.
See if anyone else pops in. But I have a question that maybe is for you, but also maybe for Brittany, and not that I want to put Brittany too much on the spot. But I'm curious because we've had so many discussions in the IIIF community about accessibility and how it fits in. And we talk a lot about how really where the community needs accessibility development and thoughtful UX design is in the ecosystem of tools. So I'm just curious from your report and from the feedback that people are giving you, what were the most pressing or maybe the most frequent requests for accessibility needs?
Text-based representation of images and video content for sure. And then right after that, what comes to people's mind is reliability kind of flag. So if that text-based representation was made from AI, mention that because sometimes it's not very good. So that's the main thing that comes up anytime anyone talks to me about this stuff. Yeah.
I'll add that one of the things that comes up in terms of accessibility is keyboard-based navigation of the interface. There is often what they call keyboard trap, where sort of like tabbing or hitting the space bar, hitting enter, depending on the reader that the user is using. You can kind of get caught in a sort of navigation loop unintentionally, and it's just because of the cues that are sort of provided behind the scenes by Mirador. They're very primitive because they are meant to be used in various combinations to support various contexts. And sometimes that gets overlooked. And you find that, you're trying to get to the image tools drop down, for example, and then you can't get out of that little menu. You have to like reload the page or something like that. So that comes up every once in a while, and we want to be able to
Right.
make sure that that goes better.
Actually, yeah, that actually reminds me, for Mirador specifically, what ended up coming up in almost all of the accessibility testers attempt to use the tool was that there's kind of a battle between the amount of functionality that's available and displayed by default from Mirador versus simplicity to help with that keyboard navigation. So yeah, that one was very, very important too.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, Caitlin, can I just ask something, which is, it's not about the release, the status in specifically, but in terms of training and working with developers, for example, of collections management systems, because in our experience, we feel that there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between the developers on the side of IIIF and the people that are implementing it in the on the ground. So do you have any plans, or do you already do this with like offer workshops and any sort of training to get developers that work with collections management systems or content management systems to integrate this and kind of keep up to date with the developments on your side? I hope that makes sense.
I think it goes in a couple of it cuts a couple of ways, but I think you're highlighting something that's incredibly important, which is, on the ground floor, on the front lines, whatever the expression is, the people who are actually working with the material, whether it's directly or in service of supporting the research that's happening either in an institution or in the context of a course. There are very clear needs that kind of rise to the surface that just don't make their way back as feedback to where all of this comes from. And so it's a little tricky. You need to rely on what resources are already kind of in place that can help with conveying information like that back and forth. Here at Harvard, we're very fortunate to have within the library where a lot of this data lives, also a user research center that does a lot of work around image researchers. Researchers researching images, and the idea of what they expect to see, how they can work, developing either personas or user journeys that sort of describe where the pain points are in those processes, where they expected something to happen that didn't, or that something's kind of displayed in an unhelpful way, and it's maybe just the raw output of the metadata that comes from the IIIF manifest or whatever. That speaks to more of the practical challenges, but then like at that higher level, that is where it gets a little harder, because then you really need to figure out what solutions, whether or not the challenge is a universal one, is one that sort of speaks to like a shared experience of challenge. And if you can get that far, to see what you can do at the core of the code of software like Mirador to be able to account for it. And that's a little bit of a long journey. And sometimes people, kind of go off on different sidetracks to be able to do that. Sometimes historically that kind of like comes into play as people just creating their own viewers for different needs. The way to get it into the core is so onerous and complicated that they find they have the resources to just kind of chart their own path. And so it goes. And then you start to kind of see the fracturing that happens, where they sort of start with Mirador, but then go somewhere else entirely. And so so it takes a number of lanes. I think the heightened attention around user experience and accessibility, again, they tend to get used interchangeably or kind of together. That's something of a sea change over the last, I would say, especially 10 years, but even in the last 5 years, the shift from the consequences of a quarantined life shifted a lot of expectations to the digital front that were just sort of taken for granted. It's like you always had another way of getting something done. And then there was a time there where that was the only way to get something done. And that sort of elevated the attention around that I think is making a difference from the long view I've had doing this sort of stuff of like 20 some years. Like there was a really slow start to this that I see is now very much picking up. So, so I think along the lines of either finding resources like the ones that Harvard's fortunate to already have, but also maybe leveraging those as resources as they contribute to the community, because they always do. I think you can find ways to connect the users that fit those needs with the providers of the technology, and ideally that there's just like an enduring partnership between the two, so that you can just sort of move that. You always have the line open to figure out like, how can this be better? How can we iterate on this?
One more from the chat. We created a tool to generate manifests using Excel. I would like to see that. I'm just curious. And it was working very well when we were using it for Universal Viewer. When we tried it with Mirador, the tool wasn't working properly. Do you think it will be easy to create manifests for Mirador 4.0?
It should be. I'm curious to know what the experience was. It just failed to load the manifest, or when you mention Excel, immediately I think of like encoding issues and special characters like accented letters or non-Western characters, kind of gumming up the works, so to say. It does, yeah, to Brittany's comment, that does sound like a really useful tool. I'd be curious to see that. I mean, ostensibly, any IIIF manifest should work perfectly in 4.0. So I suspect it might be like an extenuating circumstance, something like character encoding. It would be great to follow up. I think, does the IIIF website host a validator?
So Glenn has a validator, yeah, and it's on the website. But Kumar, I would really encourage you to join the IIIF Slack, because I think if you post this and the question, we'll get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I think to Rashmi's suspicion, I think that sometimes in the software there is like a compensation. There is some software is a little more forgiving than others. You see it all the time with web browsers, and sometimes they're doing you a favor, and sometimes they're probably not, because they're smoothing over something that you assume is not a problem. And so that could be the case there. But yeah, I second the suggestion
We
to
actually
join.
created the, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
So we created a platform called Samhita. It is called Samhita, and it is hosted on samhita.iicdelhi.in. I will share the link here. And what we did is in the backend, we created this. We created an Excel sheet where all the information coming from different IIIF platforms, which the images we took, and we had to improve the metadata. So that Excel sheet we upload on the backend, and it generates the data, and then we upload it on the server. So I'll share it in the Slack group, and let's see if some suggestions can be made. So, but it was difficult with Mirador. We had to customize a little. I don't think it is very good customization at the moment, but thank you for that.
Absolutely, and thank you. Robert.
Yeah, maybe another side question, because we started talking about accessibility and keyboard shortcuts. I was wondering, but I also haven't tried in a long time. Is there also a way, or how do other people think about it, the standard way of navigating in these newer let's say, Google Maps, post Google Maps viewers, where if you use your scroll wheel, it just makes the image bigger and smaller, as opposed to scrolling the text you're reading. And which I find not the thing I usually do a lot when I try to read a manuscript. And so I was wondering, are there thoughts about introducing something more like I can use my scroll wheel to scroll the text up and down, or use the paging keys to get to the next page and last page things as a separate mode, because it seems that it's so ingrained that every modern viewer now uses it. So if you do it differently, I guess people would be surprised or whatever. So, but maybe for people who actually want to read long manuscripts, it could be a separate mode or something. Just one of my pet peeves, because it was great with Google Maps in 1998 or whenever that started to be able to zoom in scrolly wise, but I think at least for me it had run its course, and I would like to use my scroll wheel to scroll the text, please.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to exactly the kind of way that this moves forward as an idea to implementation. Like that road starts with what is the user expecting will happen with this interface. You need to research that to understand that well. Anecdotal information won't suffice. You know, personal experiences are but one thing. You need to really get a representative sample of who you anticipate is the audience for the tool that you're building. But then you move it forward from there as what needs to happen to support that without compromising existing functionality or existing expectations. And so the idea there would speak to, like, if we're going to take this as an example of an exercise, is there like a read mode that we can add to the interface that could introduce those controls when a user needs them, and that can be easy to find. And if you're using the mouse wheel for navigating the pan and zoom, for example, but that you go into read mode, it's focused maybe only when you've got the text of the item in view, that you can implement something like that. And then that would speak to like a track of work that would go into an update of Mirador to support something like that. But only after you've kind of like passed some of those hurdles of understanding exactly what you're adding to the experience and why. And so, yeah, so I think that's exactly how this like evolves. This is how this becomes a better product. Brittany.
I can second that. That's a valid ask, because in the usability testing that we had done, that was a common ask. We actually ended up having to use the Mirador settings to turn off automatic scroll zoom, because not only do people want to control their reading experience better for the material that we have on our library, which is mostly print materials and books and stuff, but also we have stuff underneath the Mirador viewer too that people might be trying to get to. So if they scroll over the viewer, they and then that goes into the viewer content, they might not notice the content below in the page too. So I like the idea of a reading mode. And I'll message you on the IIIF Slack, I guess, Robert, if that's okay. Thank you.
We might have time. Sorry, we might have time for one or two more questions. Okay. If we don't have any more questions, then sorry,
Cut out.
I fell
There
out.
you are.
Yeah, we don't have any more questions, then I'm gonna thank Enrique for his time. Thank you for giving us this update and for giving us the opportunity to ask you questions. I'm going to second the plug for both the Mirador community calls, which are on the IIIF community calendar. Those happen bi-weekly. And then there's also the very active Mirador channel in Slack. Okay, thanks. If people have other questions, feel free to put those in Slack, or if you want to email Enrique or I will make sure that they end up in the right place. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay.